Welcome to Cpp.chat, a self-isolating look at what's going on in the world of C++, chatting with guests from the community. But before we see who's in this week's chair, John has a disclaimer to read.
Thank you, Phil. Cpp.chat is providing this podcast as a public service, but it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of Cpp.chat policy. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Cpp.chat. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on this program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Cpp.chat employees are those of the employees and not necessarily reflect the view of Cpp.chat or any of its officials. If you have any questions about the disclaimer, please contact our Office of General Counsel.
Do you have a number for that office?
We'll put that in the show notes. Promised.
Okay.
It won't help you anyway. Our general counsel is working at home and is not reachable by phone. Our guest on this adventure in Cpp.chat is Bryce Adelstein Lelbach. He is slowly but surely taking over the entire C++. What is your latest adventure, Bryce?
So somebody on Slack yesterday suggested that my eventual ambition was that Bryce would eventually become the UN Secretary General, and then somebody was like, Bryce for president. I assure you, I have no such ambitions.
They all say that.
But I am doing more and more standards work, and it's becoming an increasing part of my career. So I guess the big news is that I am no longer going to.
No. We're gonna hold off on that, and we're gonna do the other news we always do before we get to the guest. So, so that was a perfect tease. Do we have any other news? I think most of the other news is that pretty much everything's canceled.
Pretty much, yes.
There is, however, which I guess, is this in the show notes? We'll put in the show notes. There is a Reddit link that is a posting of essentially all the events. And I guess the question, I should have asked you this before we went on the air. What is the first non-canceled event? C++ event.
So I think the first non-canceled one may well be CPPCon, but one thing that I've seen start to happen in the past week or so is things have gone from just saying we're canceled or postponed to that we're going to do something virtual. So tonight, all of the Canadian C++ user groups are doing a virtual user group. We'll put details about that in the show notes. I don't remember the time exactly. And then next week, I think on Monday, Core C++, the Israeli user group, is doing a virtual meeting. Tomorrow, JF and I and Connor Hoekstrata are doing the second round of our virtual public, which is just a informal get-together of C++ people. I think we have something exciting planned for that. And then the Bulgaria C++ user group has also gone virtual. So I think we're going to see more user groups doing these little virtual events. And I think that's really good for the community. The first thing that's not yet been canceled that I know of, I'm looking at the page right now, is the Italian C++ conference. Which is in June, but I haven't checked their website in 2 days.
Phil is shaking his head like there's no way. Although Italy will probably recover before the rest of us do. So
well, we can only hope. But other than that, the next thing is CPPCon.
Although technically, I think C++ Russia postponed to June as well, but I can't see that happening either.
Oh, you're I believe you're right about that. But they haven't put up concrete dates yet. I think some people are looking at August. Most of the conferences, from what I've seen, are looking at October. Pretty much everybody that I've talked to has either said October or they've publicly said fall, but they've privately indicated to me October. Which is one of the reasons I started the Reddit thread. Was I wanted there to be an easy place for the conference organizers to see when everybody else was moving towards.
Right. Well, I mean, they're close enough as it is. Everybody wants to be in the same month. That's going to be, it's just a terrible year for us all. But I guess in the grand scheme of things, our industry is not hit nearly as badly as many. So, we shouldn't cry.
Yeah.
Anyway, is there anything else newsish that we want to get to before we talk about Bryce's campaign to take over the C++ world? Actually, your scope is broader than C++, but I'll let you explain that.
Yeah, so I guess we should start with C++. So
Doesn't everybody?
This was going to be starting after the Varna meeting, but our plans have changed a little bit. So I'm going to be stepping down as chair of the Library Evolution Incubator and the Tooling Study Group, and I'm going to be replacing Titus Winters as the new Library Evolution chair. So Titus has been chair now for, I think, 3.5 years, and he's done really an amazing job leading Library Evolution through a time of change and a time of growth. When Titus first took over Library Evolution, the committee was a lot smaller, and our goals and ambitions were even smaller. And he's really navigated us through some very difficult waters and helped us deliver a very successful C++ 20 standard and really laid the groundwork for C++ 23, which is going to be a big library release. The committee at the Prague meeting, the committee adopted a plan for C++ 23 and beyond. That plan is P0592, and that plan has 4 priorities that are must-haves for C++ 23, and those are executors, library feature, networking, library feature, modularizing the standard library feature, and coroutines library support, also a library feature. So we have a lot of work to do in Library Evolution and the main library core group for C++ 23.
Okay, so I think most of the people who are listening to this probably are fairly knowledgeable at the Standards Committee, because a lot of people on the committee are on this program and we talk about it. But just to give people a little bit of an idea, there's kind of a flow of proposals. So if I were making a library proposal, I've got some new container that I think we need to have in the library. I'm going to take this, and probably it will be discussed. If I'm lucky, it'll be discussed at Library Evolution Working Group Incubator, which is the committee that you used to chair or have been chairing. And so at the incubator, the job of the incubator is to give general guidance, to try to discourage people who are making proposals that probably are not going to make it in, to give direction for things that do look like they might be worthwhile proposals, things to avoid, things to try to make it better. At some point, loogie, as we call it, a particularly disgusting thing to say, I will say. Anyway, loogie will say, no, this is probably better to go to the next step. And the next step is Library Evolution Working Group. And the Library Evolution Working Group is what Titus has been chairing, and you're now going to be taking over. And so this is where fine-tuning of the library, not necessarily wording, but all the concepts, including naming, blah, blah, blah. Once those are good, then that committee would refer this to the library working group. And that's currently chaired. Is Marshall still chairing that?
No, Jonathan Wakely is now.
Jonathan Wakely is now chairing that. And that is a committee that tends to be made up of implementers. And so they are really interested in wording. And so they will wordsmith the final proposal, and generally we'll go into the standard from there if it's accepted. Did I get that roughly correct?
Yes, although one thing that's worth noting is, as you said, historically, Library Evolution has not been a group where we've done wording or where we've necessarily even made sure that wording exists before it goes to the core library group. But that is no longer going to be the case. Our standard operating procedures have served us well for many years, but the library pipeline on the C++ committee has been underwater for 2 or 3 years. That's one of the reasons why we formed the incubator groups. We have a significant backlog of work that we want to get done, and we have a limited amount of effort that we can spend on that work. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing going forward is the bar for proposals to leave Library Evolution and go to the core library group, because that's really where the pipeline is the core library group. The bar.
You mean the bottleneck is?
Yes, yeah, that's where the bottleneck is, because there are a limited number of implementers.
Right.
There is a wider set of people that can, do design review, but all the implementers, need to be able to provide their input on proposals at some point.
And this is one of the things that I think is kind of, I don't know how you can fix this, but you want the implementers to look at the wording, but you'd really love to have the implementers in the design group as well. Unfortunately, we can't clone them. But it is, it's why Library Evolution is such an important thing. We want senior people in there who may not have a lot of experience actually implementing the standard library, but they are good designers and hopefully can set something up that the implementers will think is implementable and worthwhile doing. And it's, you're changing the deliverables for the committee is going to make it a lot more difficult to get things through your committee, and I'm for that.
Well, and so essentially what we need to do going forward is that the bar for a proposal to leave Library Evolution and make it onto the core library group's plate is that proposal has to be ready to go. That proposal must have wording. The Library Evolution has to ensure that we only send things to the core library group when they are ready for the core library group to review. In the past, we haven't always done that. We would, once something was designed complete, we would tell the author, go generate wording and bring it to the library working group.
So there may not have been any review of the wording. There's review of the design, but not necessarily review of the wording. That puts a lot of burden on the library committee that has to do a lot more work to get that in shape.
Not only that, but proposal authors don't, in some cases, a proposal author might not be familiar with what wording needs to look like, or what we're asking for. Right. And so we're going to try to do a better job going forward of making sure that we connect paper authors with library wording experts, and that there's offline review. The language pipeline does a lot more of this. When your paper goes to the core language group, somebody from the core language group gets appointed as sort of a shepherd for your paper to help you out and to help you prepare it for review. So one of my goals is to ensure that going forward, Library Evolution and the core library group have a much closer relationship and work together to ensure that the pipeline flows smoother. And I should mention that one of the other things we've done to try and increase our bandwidth is we've introduced the notion of vice chairs for a lot of our groups. So Fabio Farchisi is going to be coming in as my vice chair for Library Evolution. And for the Library Evolution Incubator, Billy Baker is going to be taking over as chair, and Nevin Lieber will be his vice chair. And for the tooling study group, Michael Spencer will be chairing, and Ben Boykel will be the vice chair. And there's also a vice chair for the evolution working group, David Stone, and also for the evolution incubator. So now effectively, all of the main evolution groups and incubators on the committee now have both a main chair and a vice chair, which is very helpful when you're managing a large room, and it's going to be very helpful in the current era when we're going to have to be doing a lot of work remotely.
All right. So what about your ambitions outside of C++?
Yes. So I am also running as a candidate for chair of PL22. PL22 is the U.S. standards body for programming languages. So the way that ISO works, there is an international committee, and then every country has their own mirror committee of that international committee. So there's an international committee for C++, and then there is a US committee for C++. There's a UK committee for C++. There's a Canadian committee for C++. And the Programming Languages Committee is the parent group for C++, C, and Fortran. So the C++ committee within the US is called PL22.16. It's a subgroup of this group that I'm running to become chair of, PL22. PL22 itself doesn't actually, it's not as large as the C++ committee, and it does not have as many active work items as, say, C++ or C or Fortran, because the work of developing those standards is largely delegated out to the subgroups. So PL22 isn't directly responsible for C++. There's a subgroup, PL22.16, that represents the U.S. interests for C++ in the International Committee. But PL22 is still an important group because it is the parent group for all of these programming languages. And it does directly own some important things like COBOL, Pascal, the Linux standard base specifications, and a number of other programming languages.
Are COBOL and Pascal, are those ISO languages?
Yes, they are. There's actually a surprising, you'd be surprised at some of the languages that have ISO standards. So Smalltalk has a standard, Forth has a standard, APL has a standard, PL/I has a standard. There's a standard for C#, there's a standard for CLI, ECMAScript has a standard. The PL22 is also responsible for some things that are cross-language, like there's an effort for producing standards that document programming language vulnerabilities and potential safety issues or critical reliability issues. Thing like interactions with groups like MISRA C++ and MISRA C. And a lot of those sorts of efforts are managed at the PL22 and the SC22 level.
You mentioned cross-language concerns. Does that include interoperability, compatibility between particularly C and C++?
Yeah, so it's actually very interesting that you bring that up, because I just today was having a conversation with a fellow Jens who works on the C language standard, and one of the things that he's proposed recently is the creation of a C++ core specification, and I actually think this is a very excellent idea, and it's a very important thing too. It in fact might be something I might go so far as to say that this is something that we need to do to ensure the longevity of the C and C++ standard. Today, the C and the C++ standards are developed by separate groups, And the C++ standard incorporates, it's based off of the C standard, but we don't have all of the things that are in the latest C standard. There's some divergence between the two groups. And there's some things that are in C++ that aren't back in the C standard. And increasingly, we are finding that there are changes that we want to make either to C or to C++ where it is difficult to make those changes, to make, both of the languages better, or to make even just one of them better. It's difficult to make those changes unless we do it in both of the languages at the same time. And so what Jens is proposing is to form a sort of a core spec that both languages can use as a basis, and that this spec would try to reduce some of the divergence that we have today. And given some of both the technical challenges of the divergence that we have between the C and C++, and some of the organizational challenges that we're having in the C committee, I think that this is an excellent direction, and I hope that it gains traction both in the C committee and in the C++ committee. I think that some people in the C++ committee, some people are going to probably think, oh, well, whoa, we don't want to let these C guys take over. And some people on the C committee are going to probably think, oh, whoa, we don't want to let these C++ guys take over. But we have to recognize that we're a volunteer organization. We have a limited amount of effort, and C++ relies on the C standard. And at the end of the day, the C standard does rely on C++, and a lot of the people who are doing work on the C standard also do work on the C++ standard. And if we can move towards a world where we work closer together and where we have a more unified approach to things, I think we'll be able to get a lot more done.
So one of the things that I would think that, a mistake that we've made that we wouldn't make if we'd had this in place would be that there's a divergence in the C definition of bool. Believe it or not, C bool and C++ bool don't mean exactly the same thing. They're very similar, but the way they define it is different. And this is one of these things that I think if we were working together, the C++ people could have made the case that you don't want to define this almost new type. Go ahead and make it a new type. I think that's what they wanted to avoid. Is they didn't really want to make it a whole new type. Let's just make it a hack. And I think the C++ people would have argued, don't make it a hack, make it a real type.
Yep.
Because we have templates, we think of types differently than the C++ people do, or than the C people do. Because in C, for example, if your long and your int happen to be the same size, then they're the same thing. There's no situation where they're any different. They just are. Whereas in a templated world, even if they are the same size, even if everything about them is exactly the same way, if you have a function that takes a long and a function that takes an int, they're going to behave differently. Or you templatize on an int or a long. You have two different templates. They are not interchangeable. Whereas in the C world, if it's an int or a long and they happen to be the same size, then they're the same thing. And I think that's kind of the way.
You're mostly correct, although I do believe that even in C, they are still distinct fundamental types, but it's just not as observable.
They are, but that's the key, though. It's not as observable. You can't say, oh, I'm going to create a function or a template that does one thing for int and does something else for long. You just can't do that.
Yeah,
because
or I'm going to create an overload set where that contains int and long, but you can't do that because it's not a thing in C.
That's what I mean. And that's why, from their point of view, I think they think less about types than we do. We are in the C++ world, it's all about types. That's what we do, right? And so I think that they think differently. So I think this would have avoided that problem. And it's possible that the C people could have pointed at something that we did and said, if you guys had thought through this better, you'd have had a better solution. But I'm also skeptical of the thing, because one of the things I feel like, and an example might be of atomic. We have two different atomic ints, right? Because we have one that looks like a templated atomic int, and we also have this atomic int type, which is, why do we have that? Well, it's because that's compatible with C, because they don't have a syntax like our template syntax, and they're not likely to implement it. I understand they don't want to go that road. But my point is just, going forward, both languages are going to deal with the same sorts of issues, like how do you deal with Unicode, blah, blah, blah. And the best solution for C++ and the best solution for C are not going to be the same. And I have been kind of one of these people who said, look, it's really, really important that we are compatible with classic C, but going forward, we shouldn't jump through a lot of hoops to try to maintain compatibility with something when they're going to go their own way, and they should. But you're going to be in an interesting situation to straddle that fence.
Yeah. So while I certainly agree, like the case for why C and C++, should continue to exist as separate languages is that they have different mission statements, different users that they care about, different goals, and I fundamentally believe that that's true. That there is a constituency for C that just wants C, that just wants a much simpler language. And I would argue that it is a smaller constituency than exists for C++, but it does not make it any less of a valid constituency. But and I agree with you that there are certain problems like Unicode that we will want to tackle differently in C and C++, but some part of the solution of that needs to be unified. And in fact, there is some ongoing Unicode work which we are finding we have to do concurrently in both C and C++. And it'd be nice if we had a better forum to do that. We actually now have a liaison list for that purpose. And the example you gave of the C11 atomics versus C++11 atomics, that's very near and dear to my heart. We tried to make a compatibility layer in C++, but as it turns out, it's actually very difficult to write code which can be compiled, that uses atomics that can be compiled either as C++ or as C. There's this layer, C stood atomic, that was supposed to do the trick, but it had some problems in it. There was a paper for C++20 to try to fix some of those problems. I can't recall if we actually got to it in time. I think we may not have, but it's, some of us have to write code that has to compile as both C and C++, and it's very unfortunate when we have these divergences between languages, especially when there's some core things that really should be unified, even if the user-facing part of the solution is going to look different.
Well, yeah, the stuff that can be defined the same in both languages should be defined the same in both languages. I think it's over-optimistic to think that there's a lot that can be defined in both, but for those things, I mean, there's no reason to be gratuitously incompatible. And yeah. And I think that I guess what I'm saying is that it was clearly an important feature of C++ as it gained prominence, but I think it's less important a feature now. I think it's important that C++ be compatible with classic C, which don't think we're going to lose that anytime soon. We're not, anything that would break that is likely to get shouted down very quickly in the committee. But I'm willing to be convinced on issues going forward.
I think I'm definitely in the camp of I believe that it's very important that C and C++ remain compatible and evolve together harmoniously going forward.
One of the areas would be to fix volatile for both languages in the same way.
Yes, that's an excellent example.
That would be an excellent example, because you're absolutely right. Anything that we do in C++ with volatile that C doesn't do, that's going to be a problem. And yes. And I think volatile needs to be addressed in some way.
Well, I think most of the problems with volatile were in the C++ specific parts of it.
Well, that's true. I mean, what we could do is we could invent a whole new volatile and just deprecate the old volatile and say, whatever we say. implementations are free to treat it like C does for compatibility purposes, but we deprecate volatile. And if you want to do what volatile used to do, this is the way to do it in C++.
And I believe that JF did take some part of his volatile proposal to both the C committee and the C++ committee. At the end of the day, another reason why I really think we ought to work together is that there's a lot of people who work on C++ compilers also work on C compilers,
right.
And a lot of people who work on C++ language standards could or perhaps should also be working on C language standards. And right now, we have an abundance of effort in the C++ committee. That does not mean that we can do all the things we want to do, because our time and resources are limited. But the C committee and the Fortran committee are both substantially smaller. They have fewer resources, but they are vital parts of our ecosystem, and we need to ensure that that these other ISO language standards continue to get attention and continue to be evolved in a responsible and timely fashion.
So I think one of the things that at one point was proposed for C++ was that essentially every major, maybe even every C++ compiler, but every major C++ compiler had a C component that could support dynamic arrays, but there was no way that there was no standard way of implementing dynamic arrays for C++ because it's not in C++. And the proposal was shot down, and it was kind of crazy to me because I understand we have perhaps better tools, but if you're talking about standardizing existing practice, every single compiler out there has an extension in C++ because they just use the C code to allow dynamic arrays. We should, if that's a feature they all have, they should all be standardized. But I understand people pushing back and saying, but that's not a good feature. We shouldn't have it because it's bad programming. But if we do that, then we need to deprecate unordered multi-map and unordered multi-set. Those are also just bad. You shouldn't use them.
I think in that particular case, it was less a matter of bad programming, as it was sort of it was a view that feature sort of violated some fundamental tenets of the language, and had some very nasty implications that we didn't want to codify. Well, but I do generally agree with you that we ought to standardize existing practice.
Yeah, because one of the things that the compiler people, legally, the compiler people can't just get together and talk about it. So let's get this done straight. That's what the standards committee is for. If they're all going to have the same feature, they really should all work the same way, and that's what the committee is about. But maybe there should be a committee in the standards committee that is a working group that is focused on, nasty parts that we don't advise people to use. But if you're going to use it, this is how you should use it.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat room. I've always wondered why Bjarne did not originally contribute all of his changes back to C and created C++ by forking C. I don't think it was because Bjarne was unwilling to do that. I think it was more that the C community thought of C++ as this wild object-oriented thing that they, but in fact, they were open to, this is one of the things that most people I don't think know, is that the const was originally introduced in C++, and it was backported to C. It was added to C after it was introduced for C++, because I think the C community, as we are, is willing to steal good ideas, which is what anybody should do. You should be not afraid to steal good ideas. And I think that the const const was seen by the C community as, wow, that's worthwhile. We should have that. And in fact, it may even be that there were other features as well. I don't know if function prototyping was one, but some of these things that came out of the C++ world went back into C.
So the memory model, the C++11 memory model, was originally developed in the C++ committee and was brought to C. There's a number of features that have had this trajectory. There's also a number of features that started in C and came into C++. As for why they're separate languages, again, I think that that there are different constituencies for C and C++. There are people who just want C. There are people that just want the simpler language. I think it's sort of a philosophical matter whether or not you consider C a subset of C++ or not. I think the direction of the C++ core proposal would take us more in that direction of having a sort of a subset relationship.
Yeah.
Which is maybe it's a good thing.
Sure.
I mean, or let me put it to you this way: the relationship exists whether we like it or not. The fact is that our standard is based off of the C standard. And like these days, it's based off of the C standard minus a couple things, but like we do contain another language inside of our language. Right.
You know, I'm old enough. I've been doing this long enough that I actually remember the attitude about C++ is that it was that in going from C to C++, you were giving up all this performance. There was this idea that C++ was a less performant language. And now when you look at C++, it is considered higher performance, but maybe more complicated or something like that. In other words, it was at once seen as slower than C, but now it's seen as faster than whatever Java or Python or something like that, but maybe have more baggage. And it's really interesting how the world has rotated so that trying to convince people that virtual functions are not that expensive is last year's battle. Nobody cares anymore because they do think of C++ as high performance. But now the battle is trying to convince them that dealing with things at this low level is not too much of a burden for programmers.
So one of the major existing reasons, like one of the major existing use cases of C is the de facto interface for programming languages to speak to each other. And it is also the de facto way to ship an ABI stable interface. Shipping an ABI shipping an ABI stable interface in C is a lot easier than C++, because there are a lot fewer things that you can do that will subtly break your ABI. So sometimes, you know, so as much as I love C++, sometimes there's a perfectly good reason for a C++ project to have a C API, which is that forcing yourself into the constraints of C makes it easier for you to ship something that you will be able to provide an ABI stability guarantee for.
No question. I worked on a huge project where our goal was to be, we were doing a back end. Actually, we were using Objective-C as the front end. And so we had a C API layer. Totally understand that, totally buy into that. But one of the things I would point out is that it's like scientists wanting to use Latin. Why do scientists want to use Latin? Is it a particularly descriptive language? No, it's a language that never changes. And so one of the arguments about this C compatibility or using C as the interface layer is one of the things is that you don't expect that to ever change. And so that's one of the reasons why I say it's really important that C++ remain compatible with classic C. It's less important that it be compatible with things that are adding or changing about C, because that's not what people are doing, ABI stable layers and things like that. What's important there is an interface, and that interface is not, should not, cannot change.
I certainly, I think that there is a lot less of a desire for ABI evolution within the C world. I think C takes it as more of a fundamental tenet that they be compatible and ABI stable with, you know, how things have been. I think there's more of an appetite in the C++ world to be willing to move towards a better world, even if it requires ABI evolution.
Right. So do we want to shift back and talk about, I want to ask you a little bit about Loogie, your experience there. You were the first chair of that. You created that. I don't mean it was necessarily your idea, but I mean, you brought it up. You were the first chair. You created the world's perception of what this is supposed to be about. I assume you're not leaving because you thought it was an unsuccessful attempt, but maybe you did.
No, it's actually the formation of Loogie was kind of my idea. Before the San Diego meeting, I essentially sent an email to Herb suggesting maybe we should have a Lug 2 or a side group or something. And I didn't know at the point that, so Oogie was actually, which is SG17, was actually it was being created before Loogie, which might be surprising to some people because the library pipeline was where we've always had a bigger backlog. But when I sent this email to Herb saying basically, hey, I think we should try to have, we should try to find a way to parallelize the Lug workload in some way. Sabaka replied to me saying, hey, well, we're forming this new Oogie group. Why don't we form a Loogie group? And then I got tricked into agreeing to chair it. I don't remember who it was that I tried to suggest should do it. That wasn't me, but it became very quickly evident that Herb was volunteering me for this. So I've been very happy with all the work that Loogie's been able to do. For me at least, the purpose, the mission of Loogie is to filter through all the proposals that we get, take the ones that are most viable, and refine them and send them along. There's sort of two camps of people in the C++ library evolution world. There's there's people who want a really big standard library, and there's people who want a smaller standard library. Our time and resources are limited, so we can't do everything that we want to do. And in fact, we can't even do all the things that the small library camp wants, because we are so bandwidth limited. And so what Loogie was meant to do was to try and make us use our time more effectively. And it was also created to ensure that proposal authors got feedback, which we've done a good job of making sure that everybody who submits a paper, gets their paper reviewed basically at the next meeting. And
so, well, one of the things that I know because you have discussed what you think these are the things that we expect of a standard library, of a library that should be in the standard. What are the characteristics? And I think one of the things that has historically not happened enough is we haven't said no enough. We need to be more forthful and more quickly willing to say no, because, and I don't want to bring it up because we only have 5 minutes left. I don't want to bring it up, but there's one particular thing that we're probably all thinking about where a lot of effort was put into it. And then we said no. And it's like, well, the reasons we said no, we didn't have to see all that effort. We could have said no up front. Why didn't we say no up front and save ourselves an awful lot of heartache and a lot of people a lot of work? And I think that this is one of the things that the committees need to do, is to, because from the point of view of somebody on the committee, the easiest thing to decide to do is to say, do some more work and come back. Because then I don't have to commit to putting it in because, well, it's not really perfect. I don't really want to put it, but I don't have to commit to say no because, well, maybe there's something good here. And so it's easy to say, work on it some more and bring it back. And that has two problems. One is that's committing the committee to do more work in the future. And the other thing is that if it isn't something we should really be working on, it's creating a lot of work for an author that's already a volunteer and is in good heart trying to do something for the community. And for you to string them along, which, as I said, from the point of view of somebody voting, it's the easiest vote to make.
Right. And you know, it was really before Loogie got started, it was a running joke on the committee that any poll that was an encourage more work poll always passed. And one of the things that I realized early on was that those polls were dangerous. Taking polls of saying we want to encourage the author to do more work was dangerous because we were not factoring in our time, committee time. So I think the most important thing I did with Loogie was establish you know, this idea within the committee of our time and resources being limited, and that we need to factor that in to the decisions that we make. That we're not just deciding what's, you know, a good design and what's not a good design, but we have to decide on priorities. And I mean, I think one of the best things that we've done for C++ in the past year is adopted this plan for C++ 23 and beyond, which is 592. Now, I guarantee you that if you could not get consensus for each of the individual bullet points in P0592. Nobody on the committee, like there was not a consensus on the committee that was all the plan that we wanted if left up to our own devices. But everybody was willing to adopt that plan because that plan had enough of the things that we wanted, and we recognized that it was more important for us to have a plan than to not have a plan. So maybe you were like, well, you know, I really want networking, but I don't really care about modularizing the standard library. But you were willing to vote that should be a priority because having a set of priorities is super important. And having that set of priorities, you know, having a plan, having priorities will make it a lot easier for us to get work done. Because it'll make it easier for us to say, no, we can't spend time on this because we need to work on the priorities first. It doesn't mean that things that aren't on our list of priorities won't happen. It's just that we won't do work on other things if there's work to be done on our priorities. Yeah, and one of the other things that the Incubator has done is there's a lot of proposals where we're not saying no to the proposal. It's a good proposal. The problem is just that the scope of the proposal is too large. You know, mission creep is a big problem. The majority of the valuable work that Loogie does is taking a really big paper and saying, you know what, we're gonna take this part. We don't need it for right now. We're gonna like leave this part out. Just give us this core proposal, the core functionality. One of the questions that I frequently ask people is, you know, if we don't ship this component in version 1, is there anything that will stop us from adding it later? Like, if we don't add this feature in version 1 of the proposal, and we shipped version 1 in an international standard, would it be a breaking change for us to add the feature later? If so, then that feature is probably a fundamental component. If it's something that purely can be added later down the road, then should it really be in version 1? We want to do incremental evolution whenever possible. So when I was sharing Loogie, I was always looking for the essential part of the paper. You know, how much stuff can I cut out? And I wasn't even thinking about, you know, did I want that stuff or not? It was just that we had so many big proposals that anytime I could find anything that we had consensus was not necessary in version 1, even if it was something that was a great feature, then we should leave it out of version 1 so that we can ship version 1. Well,
I applaud anything that's pushing back. I think we've been too fast at getting things in. I know one of the things that you've pointed out as a criterion of putting things in the library is there original research still being done in this area? And I think if we'd asked that question with hash tables, we might not have unordered in the standard the way we do now, where people are saying don't use it. It doesn't have the performance of other available hash tables. And I think that's something we need to give more thought on, because I don't think we're someone has some new cool idea. Say, hey, this is a great library. It should be in the standard. And people don't fully appreciate what that means to put something in the standard and lock it in there forever.
And the people have talked a lot about the performance implications of locking things in. I actually think that that's the wrong conversation to have. The real conversation is, the stability guarantees that users expect and that we make in the standard library, they change how we design things. If I tell you, you have to the first version that you ship of this feature, you can't change for 10 years. And not only you can't change it, you can't add anything for 10 years. That changes your answer to the question, can I add this non-essential component later? And that means that you want to have more things in your minimal viable product because you can't necessarily add them later. And so that means that your minimal viable product is larger, but also you want to be careful and cautious about your minimal viable product because you know that you can't fix your mistakes. So on the one hand, you want to have a larger minimal viable product because you can't incrementally evolve it. But on the other hand, you want to have a small minimal viable product because you can't fix your mistakes. This makes it very challenging to standardize things.
Yeah.
It's a very tough environment. And so, yeah, we have to set the bar higher. And I think we will.
Yeah. Well, one of the things.
I just wanted, do we have time to talk briefly about what's going to happen with C++ standardization given the cancellation of the Varna meeting?
We still have a few minutes because we started a little bit late, so we should do that. But I did want to say that one of the things that I've pushed for people who are in library groups is to push back on anything that doesn't have extensive real world experience. It's not like language features where you can say, well, how can we test it? We can't really know because there's no compiler out there that supports it. Where libraries are concerned, obviously Boost is the obvious thing, but Boost is not the only thing. Anybody who puts something on GitHub by themselves probably aren't going to get enough users. It needs to have a wide user base like Boost or Absol or something like that. It doesn't have to be Boost, but I'm pushing back really hard on any library proposals where it's like, oh, we've got a working version and we've got 1,000 people who've downloaded it and they've used it a little bit. That's not enough. The trial by fire that happens with something like a Boost library it's hard to see, it's hard to measure, but talk to a Boost author and ask them if their library is better for having gotten into Boost, and almost all of them will say it was a hellacious experience, but the library is better for it.
Yeah. I mean, it is the case that sometimes there are things that we standardize that are, riskier things that, are really visionary sort of things. Like that's what the STL was back in the day. But typically, I'm looking, one of my mantras is we're looking to standardize existing practice. If you bring a proposal, I want to know, is this a thing that that Folly has some version of, and Absol has some version of, and there's some version in Boost, and there's like 5 or 10 different variants of this around the world, and everybody has a slightly different semantics. That's the sort of thing that's exactly what we want to standardize. When it's
and that's what I push back on, because I want to see a particular one that's gone on to the trial by fire. I understand that you can say, well, no, it's obviously it makes sense for us to consider that. But one of the problems is once you get that API, you don't change it. So to say, well, let's merge these 6 APIs or these 3 APIs, that's not necessarily the same as saying, well, this particular API had a few 100,000 usages.
It should, I agree, but even if it's something that has wide usage experience, I want to know that like the evidence that people have created this all over the place tells me that there is a broad demand for the feature. If you come to me with a proposal and it has 1,000 stars on GitHub and it's been used by tens of thousands of people, that's great. But if you bring that same proposal and you also point out the 5 or 10 other things out there that are very, very similar to it, that tells me that it's not just this one thing, that people have repeatedly come in across this use case and created their own version of this thing. And so it's a existing best practice across the industry and something worthy of standardization.
Okay, maybe. Let's talk about what you were saying. The standards committee has changed its schedule because of lockdown.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we're living in very uncertain and interesting and scary times right now. We've had to cancel the upcoming Varna committee meeting because of the coronavirus. I mean, we only have
and interestingly, the terminology used there was not cancel, even though it was canceled. But the terminology is it was postponed because the schedule.
To clarify, the meeting that was happening in June is canceled, but we are planning on having a meeting in Varna probably in 2021. So a meeting in Varna has been postponed, but there will not be a replacement meeting this summer, face-to-face meeting of the committee.
Right.
Now, there's only 9 meetings in between each committee release. There's 3
because we
a
have
year.
3 meetings a year.
Yeah. Now, realistically, there's only about 6 of those meetings where we can do design work. The last 3 meetings were spent doing the beta testing, where we send out the committee draft and we get feedback. So not having Varna means that we've lost a 1/6 of the time that we were going to spend on C++23. So we need to adapt to that. I mean, obviously, at times like these, family and your personal health and well-being comes first, and not everybody's going to be working at 100%. A lot of people have kids at home, and a lot of people have disruptions with their day jobs, or they're just less productive because they're cooped up in their house. So obviously, we're gonna take a bit of a productivity hit. Some people are gonna perhaps not be able to participate over the next few months as they're dealing with this really different work environment that we're in. But that does not mean that we should just say, oh, well, we're just gonna, we'll just give up and we just won't get anything done for the next couple of months. We can't do that. We have to do our best to adapt to these disruptions and carry out our evolution of C++ remotely. So JF and I, who's the chair of the Language Evolution Group, we have been putting together a plan for how we are going to evolve C++ remotely. That plan is going to go out in a paper. The basics of the plan is that we're going to be holding telecons, one for library and one for language, every week from now until October. And we're going to be relying more on things like the mailing list to do offline review. And the other thing is the way that we distribute papers. We used to have these pre-meeting and post-meeting mailings of papers. Well, even before the coronavirus, we were already moving towards a world where we were going to do on-demand paper publications. We were going to have weekly releases of papers. What we've settled on is we're going to have a monthly mailing. So every month there will be a new batch of C++ committee papers that will go out. So obviously we lose something by not having the face-to-face meeting. A lot of what we lose is not just the interpersonal interactions, the conversations in the bar, the proximity of having everybody there and working on one thing for a week. The biggest thing that we really lose is the loss of a deadline. That we had this face-to-face meeting and this, deadline a month ahead of time that you had to get your paper in to get it into that to get it reviewed at that meeting. And now we don't have that. Now we have these monthly deadlines and we have telecons, but if your thing's scheduled for a telecon, or if you were planning on publishing something in April and you miss it, the penalty now is not that you have to wait 3 to 6 months for the next committee meeting. It's I'll publish it in the next month's mailing, or I'll just ask the chair to reschedule my telecon for sometime next week.
Well,
So the
also
committee has,
having people on site for a week essentially meant they were dedicated for a week. I mean, some people were dealing with their email and they might do a bug or something if there's a hot bug comes up. But for the most part, they were spending 1 week. Seems like a lot, but it goes by really fast. But they spent 1 week that was dedicated. When people are on lockdown and they're dealing with their families and everything, and there's a telecons that lasts 90 minutes, you're not getting a week out of them. You're getting
and you have a loss of continuity. You know,
So one of the things about meetings is that if anyone wants to go, they are open to anyone to come and observe. Is this going to be true of your telecon? Are you going to make the schedule of this public, and are you prepared to have, maybe several dozen C++ programmers who've never been in a meeting before just decide to tune in to find out how exciting it is to talk about volatile?
Yeah, so I knew that this question was going to come up, and in fact, I had put the draft of our plans on GitHub and just on my personal GitHub, and I've already gotten emails from people saying, "Hey, I saw that you put this on GitHub. I'm interested. How do I sign up?" So the committee, nothing has changed about committee participation. Which is that anybody could show up to a face-to-face committee meeting. The people who are sort of allowed to officially be members of the committee are people who have joined through their national body. But what we typically say is, if you show up to a face-to-face meeting, then we'll give you access to the mailing lists and the wiki and whatnot. And you can participate even if you're not, officially a member of your country's national body. Obviously, times have changed a bit, but with the remote meetings, that sort of changes what that bar looks like. So we have talked about this. The way that we're going to do things is the way that we've always done things, which has been that if somebody wants to get access to the mailing list or the wikis or participate in the meetings, and they have not attended a face-to-face meeting, all that they need to do is to speak with a chair on the committee, and a chair on the committee can always request that an expert who is unable to attend face-to-face meetings be allowed to participate in the committee process. There have been people over the years. Peter Dimov is a great example of a C++ expert who has been unable to attend face-to-face meetings, but who participates in standardization through the mailing list, through the wiki, and who would be able to participate in these telecons. So we're not going to open up these telecons, to the entire world, in that we're not just going to publish, a link where anybody can join. But if you are interested in participating, you can reach out to the chairs of the groups that you'd like to participate in and have a conversation with them about it. And that is our current plan for how we're going to do things. These are uncharted waters for the committee. We have a bit of field experience with doing telecons. The tooling group, the Unicode group, the core group, the library core group, all have done telecons in between meetings for many years. The education group have all done telecons. SG14 has done telecons. We've even got some experience doing decision making on telecons. So we have some experience, but we don't have experience with having all of our groups operating remotely. We don't have experience with the sudden loss of deadlines that we've relied on. We don't have experience with operating in a world where we need to spread out our work over a few months instead of concentrating it all into 1 week. And the committee is going to have to learn to adapt over the next couple of weeks and months. We will need to learn how to exist in an environment where we don't have these hard deadlines, where we're not going to have a 1 week period where we're sequestered with each other. And I'm confident that we'll be able to be successful here. It's going to be challenging. I'm sure it's going to be rocky, and I'm sure it's going to be overwhelming. But we will get through this. And the other thing I want to make clear is that the committee is and always has been a volunteer organization, and we know that this has been, we know that the ongoing coronavirus pandemic is very disruptive to people's lives. We're not expecting everybody to continue participating in the way that they always have. Like, we get that everybody has day jobs, we get that everybody has families. And if you're unable to participate, that's perfectly fine. That does not preclude you from participating later once we get past this and once things return to as close to normal as can be expected. Obviously, some things are going to change and stay that way. But if you're unable to participate, if you can't join a particular telecon, that does not mean that your voice will not be heard. That does not preclude you from being involved. Nobody is going to say, well, your opinion on this paper doesn't matter because you weren't able to join this telecon in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Nobody needs to have a fear of missing out.
All right. Well, so we're a little over on time, but I am glad that you went over that kind of stuff because that's important for us to know. And there will be people who will join who've never gone to a committee meeting, and you might find them a valuable source of insight, and that would be terrific. Maybe they'll get wrapped up enough that they'll continue to work with the committee. Maybe never appearing on site, maybe being like Peter Demov, somebody who contributes remotely, or maybe they'll find a way to come to the committee. Either way, I think some good things happen out of the worst tragedies, and so something good will come of this.
I certainly, if we are successful in executing remote operations, I see no reason that we would not continue to do so in the future, probably at a lesser scale. We're going to be we're going to have multiple meetings every week for the next few months. That's probably not something we're going to do long term. But if we find telecons to be effective, there's no reason that we wouldn't have a monthly telecon meeting of library evolution. Like, if it works, why would I stop?
One of the things that I've observed about this, having worked with things like conferences and things like that, is if you are working with volunteers who have a lot of things on their plate and they're juggling their lives and homes and work and all these things, having a regular thing is kind of a tickler. That's right, I got to spend some time on that because I wanted to get that, and I want to be able to report that some forward happened, so I better dedicate a few hours. So having a monthly telecon in addition to the regular meetings, once things get back to normal, might turn out to be quite promising.
Yep.
Any thoughts on this on Phil? I know that you do a lot of telecon work, but I know you also do a lot of face-to-face stuff.
Yeah, well, I do think that there is a positive side to it. You say that there are going to be people that haven't been able to participate before who can now, and we will make it a taste for how that works and make that more of an opportunity on an ongoing basis. We're just going to see how that works, but it's going to be a new way of working for a lot of people, but we're all learning this as we go along at the moment. So it's a good time to test the waters, I think.
All right. So Bryce, congratulations again on your next step in your quest for world domination. And I urge you to join us in wishing all of our listeners safe coding. So safe coding, everyone.
Safe
coding, everyone.